I want to welcome back Mr. C.T. Butler, co-founder of Food Not Bombs, and a whole host and list of other things which you'll be able to see on our Etherpad. He put the example up that all guests coming after him will have to follow. He set a pretty high standard. So we're grateful for that. And for those of you who are just joining us, tonight is the second in our series with C.T. Butler. Tonight's topic is going to be Food Not Bombs and his experience with that organization, and you will broaden out on some tangents about food justice, and of course it's all about social activism. I want to welcome any other channels that might be mirroring us. We really appreciate your guys' support and continued viewership with us, and we hope we're going to give you a good show tonight. We got a lot of topics to cover, and I'm going to work to try to keep it focused so everybody doesn't drift off into the twilight for all you oldsters out there. So welcome back, CT. We're glad to have you.
Great to be here.
And we know Ren is in the chat with us tonight. Welcome, Ren. It's wonderful to have you here. And I think we're going to introduce a very special co-guest tonight. And, if everybody wants to hang on a little bit, I met this young fellow last night. There he is.
Say hi, everybody. Woohoo!
That dog is smiling. I love that.
Yep,
Look at that.
This.
Yep.
Yeah, on TV. Wow.
Yeah,
okay.
He's worldwide.
Woo-hoo.
What a beautiful dog. Thank you very much. We love to occupy animals and all the guest animals, and also now Ren's taking them back to the green room and going to give them a cookie. So that's funny. So let's get right into it. My first question is there enough healthy and edible food available to feed everybody? And you might have some statistics to share around that.
Well, certainly in the United States, the answer is yes. The United States is a breadbasket, and it has plenty of food grown here. Of course, we ship a lot of the food around the world, and we also import a lot of food from around the world. The more salient question probably is there enough waste food that's normally thrown away but it's perfectly edible, to feed all the people who can't feed themselves? And in my mind, that includes not just people who are economically disadvantaged, but also people who are in prison, people who are elderly and can no longer care for themselves, young children who are in daycare, people in hospitals. There's all these people who are in a situation where they need food and they really can't get it for themselves. And we actually don't have to spend any tax dollars to feed all those people. We could just recover the food we're currently wasting in our food stream, and the edible part of that food stream that's wasted, we could recover and feed all those people, and there would still be food left over.
Very good point. And so when you talk about recovering the food into food stream, can you be specific about what that food
Sure.
stream is?
In the capitalist system, because of the way it's set up, it's designed to have surplus. Each producer of food or any widget, any commodity, when they come to market, they plan and intend to bring a certain percentage more than they expect to sell, because they never know exactly how much they're going to sell, and they hope for a good day, and they don't want to lose customers if they could sell it, and it's cheaper to bring extra than it is to lose customers. It's not have enough.
Right.
So that includes the farmers in the fields, the people who actually grow the food in the first place. They produce more than the market needs. And a certain percentage of it gets left in the field, a certain percentage of it gets left in the warehouses and storage bins, and a certain amount gets lost and wasted along the way of transporting it to either the market, but a vast majority of the food doesn't go directly to market. It goes to food manufacturers, people who do stuff to the food to turn it into something else. And there, again, there's all kinds of waste and surplus, and they also produce more than they expect to sell. So even their end product often goes to waste, a certain percentage of it, and then they sell it to distributors who distribute it to the retailers who sell it to the customers. And every one of those steps, both the person selling it to the next person in the step produces more than they actually need of the end product, plus there's various kinds of waste from an economic standpoint, food product that the person using it cannot use. They cannot sell it. So to them, it's waste. Sometimes they create byproducts and other things with it, but most of the time they just throw it to the waste stream. So there's all kinds of food being both wasted, still edible, and surplus, not sold, but still far enough up the food chain in terms of freshness that it's not bad food. Mm-hmm. So there's literally millions of tons of food being wasted each day in the United States. That, and I saw recently an article that, based upon research that I did in the 80s, I would say that potentially a full 50% of all the food that's grown never gets eaten.
That's astonishing.
Yes.
That's astonishing.
So, and we don't have a cooperative system. We have a capitalist system, a competitive system. So you have to build in waste in order to get ahead. Okay,
and so I'm laying out a scenario here so we can kind of play with it later on. It sounds like we do not have a food supply problem. The volume there, the quantity is there. We have a distribution problem.
Correct.
A distribution problem. Okay, so let's put, thank you for that little intro, and so we're going to put that to the side, but I just want everybody to keep that in mind, and that 50% waste thing is absolutely amazing. And that is, just to be clear, that is based on stuff in the United States. That's not worldwide, but similar trends exist worldwide. I mean, maybe different percentages, but for the most part.
Yes, well, certainly everywhere in the world that there are rich people, and there are rich people everywhere in the world, every country, those rich people are producing surplus and waste that could be, that when at the point that it's discarded, it's still edible, the food. I'm just talking about food.
Yeah, that's what, this is.
There's food being wasted.
Okay, perfect. Now, what I want you to do is take us way back in the time machine. 2 days before the original idea of Food Not Bombs was spoken out, I want you to set the scene for us, and then I envision Food Not Bombs as having been created out of thin air by this group of people. So I want to get us 2 days before the first person said, hey, let's do something. And I want to hear how you and that group built Food Not Bombs.
Well, it didn't actually happen that way, but that's a nice, I like the romanticism of that. So this is what happened. I met, and I'll build, for those of you who were here yet last night, I'll use a couple of stories that I told last night. I won't tell the stories again. But you remember I was talking about being a part of the Coalition for Direct Action at Seabrook, which was protesting the Seabrook nuclear power plant in 1979, 1980. There was a large group of people that lived in Cambridge, a lot of young people lived in Cambridge that were protesting that and were involved in that, maybe as many as 1,000 living right in Cambridge. It was a large group of people. And I said last night that one of the activists who I happened to become a friend of mine because we looked alike, named Brian, was arrested at the May 24th action, and he was left alone. Basically, after May 24th, the entire anti-nuclear movement basically evaporated. We thought we had failed. But Brian was left facing trial. So the people that coalesced around him were the cosmic dust cloud that eventually coalesced into the planet Food Not Bombs. And so we were swirling around this activism around defending and protecting Brian at first, and then once we were successful and got him off, then we continued meeting together and playing together and dancing together and doing activism together, this maybe group of 20 people or so. And we said we don't want to stop organizing and educating about nuclear power in particular. Nuclear weapons was also very important to us, and given that nuclear weapons were designed at MIT, at Draper Labs, right down the block from our house, we felt a mandate to raise awareness that nuclear weapons were being built and designed, not built, but designed right there. So we wanted to continue organizing, and so we talked about getting a house. There were a number of collective houses in Cambridge at the time. Maybe at its peak, as many as 20. It involved 10, 15, 20 people living in the house, doing activism, and having various kinds of odd jobs, usually. And so we were talking about doing that, but we didn't like the idea of having to get a job for what we, back then we said, a job for the man. Working for some business, working for a corporation, just to make money to live day in and day out. And we were also working. I was working in a restaurant as a Mexican restaurant as a cook. Other people were working at the food co-op, other stores, and we saw this food being thrown away that was perfectly edible. So we started taking it home. We didn't ask anybody. We just started keeping it. And it turned out it was quite a bit of food. We could live on it. And of course, that meant we had to do less hours of work to buy food. And so we saw that as an economic advantage, and it made it more feasible for us to get a house together because we wouldn't need as much money. And we had very low-paying jobs. Another house down the street from where we lived, it was called the Broadway House because it was on Broadway Street. They were already doing dumpster diving at various grocery stores, and they were getting lots of food, and we were helping them do that. And we learned the ins and outs of dumpster diving with them. Actually, Chris Worthington is now a city council person in Berkeley, California, and he was the person at the Broadway House teaching us that stuff. And so we realized there was lots of food, and we could get it, and we were mostly getting it to eat ourselves, and also because we were concerned about waste. We were throwing it away. We saw that as an environmental insult to the planet. That here we grew this food, trucked it halfway across the country, and then threw it in the garbage can and dumped it in the ocean. That just seemed insane. So we started talking about a plan to get more of that food and use it as a fundraising tool so we could not have to go to jobs. That was that was sort of the idea. That was the kernel of the idea. Was that there's so much food, we were seeing this food flowing by, there's all this waste food, and if we could get enough of it, we could turn that into resources, turn that into money, and not have to have jobs. And we could do activism full time.
Right.
And basically that's what we did. And so the next thing that happened, and it was funny, we had to come up with a name for our group, right? Because we were starting to form a group. And maybe 3 or 4 months before we got our house on July 1st, 1981. So several months, and Brian got off on the charges in December of 1980. So between December of 1980 and July of 1981 is the era I'm talking about, okay? So we were still protesting, we were still going to actions and stuff that other people were organizing. We were now helping to organize, and we were talking about this idea of getting a house and getting this food and bringing food to demonstrations and things like that. So we got some food together. I don't remember exactly how we got it. I suspect maybe we bought it, but we did sort of like a bake sale at Boston University in their commons area. And we had a banner that said, "Food for free," because that was our politics, right? We thought that food should be free. It shouldn't be a profit-making commodity, which produced all this waste. That food should be for everybody. So that was a great action. We had this bake sale. We also were riffing on the poster that came out at the time, which said, "It'll be a great day when the Air Force has to hold a bake sale to buy a bomber." So here we were in a bake sale. I think we even dressed up as military types, and we were telling people to give money to us so we could be military for peace, or soldiers for peace, or whatever we were saying. I don't remember the exact rhetoric, but we were basically using those ideas. And the problem with the name "Food for Free" was that no one gave us any money. They said, "Oh, the food's for free? Great, thanks. I'll take as much as I can." And they did. We didn't care. The food was for free, but they didn't give any donations, which is what we were trying to do. So we decided to change our name, and we had I vaguely remember that it was driving around in our van that we actually settled upon the name Food Not Bombs, but I do know that where it came from was that one of our founding members, Keith McHenry, was a graphic artist. He had gone to BU as an artist, an art student, and he was doing graffiti. And we would all go out and help him, and he would organize these graffiti parties, if you will. And one of the slogans we were fond of spray painting, particularly in front of grocery stores, was "Drop food, not bombs." Okay, so that was this thing we spray painted. Mm-hmm. And so we were talking about various names, and somebody just said, "Well, how about food, not bombs?" Because another important thing was that we had been activists long enough, like all of a year at this point, maybe, for me, not even 6 months, right? I had been started October, so this is now April. I've been an activist for 6 months, and I'd already learned that when you do a protest and the media covers it, not only do they talk about the arrests and the police action and the traffic, but they never actually mention that you were protesting nuclear war and the threat of nuclear war. But the groups were often called the September 6th coalition, or something like that. It didn't say anything,
Right.
So you could read the whole article in the media about the protest and never know what the protest was for.
Messaging.
Yeah, messaging. So to sabotage that, we said we want our political message to be in the name of our group. So when they say the name of our group, they'll be saying our political message: food, not bombs.
That was a good move.
We settled on that. That's what we reached consensus on, was to have that name. We never dawned on us that would then make it so they would white us out of the newspapers and wouldn't even mention our group's name.
Well,
and to this day, we get very, very little ink in the mainstream media. Very little.
Right. And typically when I've seen it, it hasn't been the most complimentary thing. It's always kind of, from mainstream media, kind of a complaining thing. And I do want to touch on that later on. So I want to hold the book up, because here's the book, Food Not Bombs. This is original, C.T. Butler and Keith McHenry. And I want everybody to see this, and I encourage everybody to read it, because there are some parallels in there that are astonishing. But I want to show you, because I'm going to get into this a little bit. It's a sweet little book. It's an easy read. It's very clear and emphatic. But also in the back, there's all these appendixes. So see, we have prepared flyers, we have recipes, we have meeting agendas, we have what to do if the police start taking your food. This is the book that was released in, was it 92? I think it is.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, 92.
Yep.
There's a flow chart of consensus decision making. There's checklists. All right, so you guys get the picture, right? Because the question I'm leading up to here is, there was 20 or so people, and my understanding is that group kind of shrunk down to about 8 core members, right, that were the co-founders of Food Not Bombs as we envision it today.
Correct.
When you went out to those first actions, did you do it just like you just hauled a bunch of crap out there and you did it? Or did you have a system and a plan and an organized methodology?
Both.
Okay, good.
So what that looks like is that our first feed, our first, cooking up food and taking out and going to a protest, was a protest that I was an organizer for. In my CDAS clamshell hat, I had taken to heart the idea that you follow the money. And so I had started what I called the First National Bank Committee. First National Bank Project, it actually was called. Happened to be FNB Project. That's totally coincidental. But what the idea was, and it was a man named Adam Oster who did this with me, and we spent those 6 months after the May 24th action in 1980, we spent the next year or so meeting and talking. It was just a small handful of us, but we looked into where the money came from to build Seabrook. And we learned and we discovered for our own selves this concept of interlocking directorates. And it really turned out that it was true that the board of directors of the public utility companies of New Hampshire which was the people who ordered the Seabrook nuclear power plant, who wanted to build it for electricity, that half of their board members, or some number of their board members, also sat on the board of the construction company that was going to build the nuclear power plant, who benefited directly from building it. And a certain percentage of those board members and the other also sat on the Bank of Boston board, who financed the whole project. So you have the same handful of men who were making the decision to build the nuclear power, who was going to build it, the company was going to build it, and how it was going to get financed. It was the same people. It wasn't separate people looking over their shoulders to make sure it was legitimate or valuable. It was a setup. So we were really angry. So when we learned in March of 1980 that the board of directors of the First National Bank of Boston was going to have their annual board meeting at the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston, which happens to be across the street from where Occupy occupied their encampment in Boston, and also across the street from South Station, we decided to hold a protest and to educate the board members that what they're doing is a crime, in our opinion, this collusion of conflict of interest. And so what we did was we invited all of our activist friends to show up at this protest at noon, at lunch, during the meeting day, the board meeting day. And we said, dress up like the Depression era, the Great Depression era, hobos and bums and such, and we'll have a soup kitchen. And our artistic message will be, if you continue with your current policies, this is what America is going to look like in, let's say, 30 years. And so, and then Keith got the idea that we go and leaflet the homeless men who were living at the Pine Street Inn, which was a place that housed a couple hundred homeless men each night in Boston. And we didn't really know much about that. We just thought that would be a good idea. And to our real surprise and pleasure, about 50 of those men showed up for lunch. And we fed them. We had about 50 activists that showed up, and we fed all of them. And then there was maybe another couple of dozen people who milled around. The media showed up. Some board members weren't total capitalists, and they came and talked to us, and we fed them too. So we fed about 150 people at our very, very first action, and it was a tremendous success. I went and visited Occupy this year, back in October, Boston Occupy Boston, across the street, and now they've got all those vehicle barriers on the plaza. But in 1981, we literally drove our van up onto the sidewalk, up onto this plaza that's out in front of the bank, and just opened the side doors of the van and set up tables right out in front, just operated right out of the van. You couldn't do that today.
No. That's a wonderful image, though. I mean, yeah, in contrasting to what we're dealing with today.
So that was before we even got our house, and we weren't necessarily calling. I think at that point we were still calling ourselves Food for Free, and that was our very first protest. So that went really, really well. So we knew we could do that. So we did start showing up at every event we could, and our own events, and brought food. And that we just showed up. We just did it as part of the protest. But quite quickly, the other part that's not been mentioned is that, and this is something that was very important actually, was that we started collecting more and more food. Because, again, we didn't want to waste the food. It was a political statement about not wasting it. And to our surprise, because at this point we didn't realize how much was being wasted. And we weren't even going for the big supplies, because we only had a 68 Dodge van, panel van. We could only get so much food. So we were mostly going to the food co-op and the mom and pop grocery stores and the local bakeries. We weren't dealing with the big mega stores. They threw away too much. We couldn't haul it away. It was too big. So, but even just organizing all of the small grocery stores and small restaurants and small bakeries that were in Cambridge, just Cambridge, it was way more food that we could eat ourselves or give away at protests on the weekends. It was more food. Right. So we actually had the slogan in our house, once we got our house, was, "This is the revolution. We're eating as fast as we can." Because we always had more and more food coming in the front door. It was always more food. But what that speaks to is that I was getting up every morning early with the sun, because that's when the food industry operates, And I would drive around Cambridge and go to these various places every day and pick up food and bring it back to the house, and we would give it away in bulk. We didn't cook it and serve it most days. Most days we gave it away in bulk, and on the weekends we went to protests and rallies and served meals. And we still weren't primarily doing what Food Not Bombs groups do today. We were still just beginning that idea. Mostly we were going to other people's protests, and we were giving away bulk food to other activist groups that were organizing poor people, because that's who wanted to eat it.
Right, right.
So while our very, very first action was our own action, I mean, because I was an organizer for this committee, and I had Food Not Bombs be the central part of the protest, and that is what Food Not Bombs groups do today, is the Food Not Bombs group itself is the protest. Most of what we did in the early days was go to other people's protests and bring lunch.
Okay, good, because you were operating early on as an affinity group, as we talked about last night, in support of other groups that were doing the organizing, and then over the years, Food Not Bombs grew to an organizing entity. I think it's important to make that relationship. We talked a little bit about anarchist principles last night. Was Food Not Bombs conceived of, and did they utilize anarchist principles like a collective effort? Totally. Yep.
Totally. I mean, we were collectively, we were reading every piece of anarchist literature we could find from history. We even had a whole thing in our collective about Living My Life by Emma Goldman. We were very knowledgeable Emma Goldman and that era in the United States. But we were also reading the theorists, Kropotkin and Buchanan. We were also reading Marx. We were reading we were educated, and we were reading, like I said, we read the Weather Underground Manifesto. We were immersing ourselves in information about what had come before us, something I thought was very, very important. And we conceived, we didn't use the anarchist word a lot because it wasn't used a lot on the street, if you will. We were really activists. We more defined ourselves as nonviolent direct actionists, anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons, because those are the big issues of the day. Because at this point, the Cold War was still raging, and nuclear war was on everybody's mind. It was imminent, as far as anybody knew. So, but I love the story. One of the big things that we did in our house, because we were very prominent, we went to everybody's protests. We were like the bartenders, right? We had the food. So everybody came over to our table and talked to us. So I kept running into these, what I considered young anarchists, didn't matter what their age was, and they would say that they thought that anarchy meant that there was no rules. There was freedom. You could do whatever you wanted. Nobody could tell you what to do. And so I would, try to talk about how, no, you need to have cooperative rules. You need to be able to have some organization. And they would push back against that and say, no, total freedom. Do whatever you want. No rules. And so eventually I came to say, oh, so the first rule of anarchy, according to you, is that there's no rules. Because that is a rule. Right. That's what they're claiming. So and I came to realize in my own mind that the idea of no rules is just not possible in the human condition. It's similar to what I find nowadays, and especially within the Occupy movement, the idea of no structure. And that's also a bad idea. The trying to have no structure is a structure in itself. It just doesn't work very well as a structure. It doesn't hold anything up. Right. So we actually made a sign on our wall in our original collective house on Harvard Avenue, 195 Harvard Street in Cambridge. And the sign had said, no rulers, not no rules. Because so many anarchists would argue with us about how anarchy meant no rules. And we said, no, when we make cooperative, and it was very clear from history too, when the union, when the affinity group, when the collective made a decision and said, this is going to be our rule, how we're going to run ourselves, then everybody in the collective was expected to abide by that rule because they helped make it. And if they acted unilaterally outside that rule, that was considered dictatorial. That was considered acting like a fascist. Obeying the collective rules was anarchy.
Because everybody subscribed to them equally and contributed to their development.
Correct. And that's, of course, where consensus became so important, because we strived for hearing every person's voice, and we didn't make any decision until we were reasonably confident that everybody was on board.
Excellent. And that was going to follow, my next question was going to follow about, was there leadership within the group, and what was your decision-making process? So we've established that it was a consensus process. And
very much so.
I know we're going to get, for those of you who don't know, we're going to get deep into consensus tomorrow night. Okay. So I don't want to go way down that road, but I think it's a good idea if we define what consensus is, just so everybody understands that. In my understanding, consensus is not necessarily unanimous agreement.
That's a very important point. That's correct.
Okay. So continue on that, because I'll stumble all over it.
Okay. It is consent rather than agreement or agreeing. So, and it's very clear that you can give your consent to a decision without agreeing with it.
Okay.
You can actually be opposed to it, but for other reasons say, I'll allow it to happen freely and willingly. I'm not being coerced. I'm not being manipulated. I'm freely educated and knowledgeable, but I'm allowing it to happen even though I am against it, even though I'm opposed to it, because I have my own motivations. I have my own reasons. I have reasons that are why I'm giving my consent.
Right. So you consent for the greater good, putting aside your particular. Okay, good.
Correct. And that's an important concept, even though the dictionary written by white corporate men says that it's a complete agreement or general agreement. It's not. It's consent. Duh. It's consent. Where's my cardboard? So anyway, and what it really is about, more importantly, is it's about creating a culture where instead of trying to be right as an individual and having the answer and having the best idea, what everybody's trying to do is come up with what is best for the group, what works best for everybody in the group. And everybody's invested in that. So you want to bring along even the least agreeable, the person who doesn't like it. You want to include them as well. They're still part of the group. So you don't railroad anybody. You don't dominate anybody. You don't use minority, create a majority so that you can overrule the majority. None of that happens. There's not need for leaders because the leadership roles rotate around the group, so everybody develops a deep bench of leadership. Very important when you're doing direct action out in the world.
Right.
So we didn't have leaders. No one was a leader, but everybody took leadership roles, and we rotated them. And even the shy and meek ones were encouraged to step up as best they could and with a lot of support and love to be in the facilitator role or to be the person out in the public speaking to the media, even when they felt totally tongue-tied. We encourage everybody to rotate that and to get the skills.
That's
the culture consensus I'm referring to.
Okay, that's good, and I can't wait for us to get into that tomorrow night. But while you're talking, it made me think there are no leaders because everybody is a leader, and the strengths of everybody are supported by the group. So everybody gets a turn, everybody gets a chance, and it's a good tactical move, because if somebody is taken out of action for whatever reason, the whole thing doesn't stop. Somebody else can step in, and it'll be done maybe differently, but equally as well. The project keeps moving forward.
Right. And I was talking earlier about we learned that if we're successful, this government takes you out.
Right. Exactly.
They did the thing in the Civil Rights Movement and the Panthers and the Black Power movement. So we knew that we didn't want that to happen to us, so we were using a different tactic and a different strategy to make that not as effective, not as necessary from the state's perspective. And it appears to have worked because I'm still alive.
Well, for that we're fortunate. So let's talk about the evolution of Food Not Bombs from the early days in Cambridge, maybe a little bit of a timeline, and how the organization has morphed and changed to whatever it is today. And if you want to speak to what it is today to give us an illustration, that would be helpful. So the evolution of Food Not Bombs from Cambridge out into the world.
Right. So we've talked basically the early years, the era from 1979 to 1982. Okay, and that was the original collective, the house, came out of the Clamshell Alliance or the CDAS, and was a small number of people. It was an affinity group. We had this house. We had food available all the time. We had a great working relationship with the Cambridge police. We were being surveilled all the time. We had the Secret Service and the FBI raid our house a couple of times. We would call the Cambridge police when the FBI or the Secret Service raided our house so that they would come and protect us. And they understood that, and they did. I'll never forget when the Cambridge police showed up one time and the Secret Service said, "What are you doing here? You're not welcome here." And I said, "We invited them. They're our guests." So we were at a great, that was part of that whole culture. And we had lots of young people. I mean, I was an old guy. I was 26, right? So I was old. Most of the people who were in Food Not Bombs were in their late teens and 20s. And then we had a lot of high school kids hanging out at our house. I would be the one who got the call from the high school parents attacking me or challenging me around tainting their children. And I simply told them, I said, "Look, you can tell them they can't come back to our house because I'm not going to lie to you about what's going on here. But what they're doing here is they're volunteering and helping us sort and distribute the food so we can feed people. And if they weren't here, they'd be doing the exact same thing they're doing that you don't want them to be doing on the street, and they'd be in danger. But at least they're here in our house, they're safe, and they're doing something constructive. Volunteering for Food Not Bombs. It's up to you. You're the parent. You can tell them never to come back here, and we'll enforce it. We won't let them come back. But that's your choice. I think they're safer and healthier being here." Anyway, so that was that era. We were also really working well with the city council. We had a great working relationship with the local government, is my point. So we built, there was a major protest that happened. And at the time, it was the largest protest in history in the United States. It was around the UN was having disarmament talks around the strategic weapons, strategic arms disarmament talks. It was called SSD2. And it was held on June 12, 1982. And the organizers, and we were very involved in organizing it. We brought a lot of people down from New England. We brought a huge amount of food. We were planning to feed everybody. We were planning for 100,000 people, and 1 million people showed up. Took over Central Park. It's also the famous Alexander Haig, who was Secretary of State. General Alexander Haig was Secretary of State. And that's when he famously said, "Let them he was apparently looking down over Central Park and saw this 1 million people protesting, and a reporter asked him, is that going to change U.S. policy? And he said, "Let them protest all they want. As long as they pay their taxes, doesn't matter."
That's just terrible arrogance.
Yeah, exactly. So we were at that protest, but it was a very disastrous day. It didn't work out very well for us at all, and I won't go into the politics of it, but we basically were sold out by the organizers of the protest, Mobilization for Survival folks, because they needed money, and they sold the rights to vend food in Central Park to the mafia for hot dogs and pretzels and soda, and they said if we show up and serve food, they'll have us arrested. We did it anyway, but we had many of the people that were going to do it bailed out because they didn't want to get arrested.
Right.
And we didn't get arrested, but it was a disaster for us. It was a logistical nightmare. It was a horrible experience, and it really busted up our collective. And that was the beginning of the end of the original collective. And within a year, we had all disbanded. So by 1983, we were all dispersed. So basically, in 1983, Food Not Bombs ended. But we kept doing this food distribution network in Cambridge. Brian and I stayed in the house, and we kept doing the daily food distribution because it was just too awesome to let go.
Right.
And if anybody doubts that, that group still exists. It's called the Food for Free Committee. It went back to the name Food for Free Committee because we split the political activists and the charity food, if you will, collecting the food. We split that in 1983. And we formed a nonprofit that still exists in Cambridge. I put the link on the Etherpad. And in fact, I was there last October being honored. And I saw Brian for the first time in a decade because we were the original board, and the current board had the original board come to be honored for 30 years of providing free food to Cambridge, Massachusetts. This year, they're distributing 2 million pounds of food in the Boston area. That's phenomenal. So awesome. But that's just the food distribution side of it. That got split off. So I kept doing that, and that got split off into Food for Free. I was eventually moved out of the house. Eventually, the house fell into private hands. It was no longer a collective. And I moved into a little apartment. And I had a job as a chef. I worked in a French restaurant. But I hated it because I was working for the man. I was really angry still. And I decided to see if I could make a go of being a caterer to the movement. Going back to the old Food Not Bombs, for me, the old Food Not Bombs days. And this was 2 years later, right? 1984. Going back to 1982 when we were going to all these rallies and protests every weekend. And I said to myself, if I go to 4 or 5 events a weekend, I can probably make enough in donations, just giving the food away but collecting donations, that I can buy the food and pay my rent. And that's what I did. I did that from 1984 to 1988 in Cambridge. So that was pretty much what Food Not Bombs was in that era.
Mm-hmm. And when you were doing the catering for events and stuff like that, was that solo, or did you have a small group, a collective, and did you have some people to help, or were you just kind of just doing that thing on your own?
Well, I always had people to help, but they were almost always sort of paid. They got to take home as much food as they wanted, and it was a volunteer thing. I did have a housemate named Rob Anderson. He now goes by Tom Anderson. He's in Hawaii now. He did it first. He moved in and stuck. I went through a number of roommates that would come by, they'd stay for a while and leave, and then he came by and stuck, and he stayed around. He did it for a couple of years, and so he was my right-hand man. I mean, he always did it. And then eventually, by 1986, late 86, 87, we did have a core group, and we started having meetings as a protest group again, as a separate, independent affinity group. We actually also hooked up with a theatrical company that was being directed by a man named Rain House, who had been in the original Living Theater with Julian Beck. And he was now living in Cambridge, and he was doing this theater group, a guerrilla theater group, and we joined our little Food Not Bombs group, and their theater group joined together, and that was how Eric Weinberger was introduced to the Food Not Bombs group, and Eric Weinberger was mentioned by Howard Zinn in the foreword to the Food Not Bombs book. And Eric has since died, but he deserves a special story about his role in Food Not Bombs and how Food Not Bombs served him. It's a whole other story in itself. But anyway, that was how he got involved with Food Not Bombs. And eventually I left Cambridge in 1988 and turned the Food Not Bombs, now affinity group again, over to Eric and a man named Dan the Bagel Man, who's somewhat famous around the country. That was his beginnings as an activist, was in Food Not Bombs, and they were the core members, and then there was always a group of people around them who did Food Not Bombs. Keith McHenry had moved into a collected house in Boston and was doing a small distribution network himself, or through his group house. But he was mostly doing graphic arts. He had a graphic arts business. And then he left town in a rush. He had to leave town quickly at a certain point in his life. And a year later or so, he turned up in San Francisco by 1986. And I started visiting him in 1987. And I saw the beauty and the possibility of starting a Food Not Bombs group in San Francisco. So we'd have two, and we'd be a national group, because I have one in Boston and one in San Francisco. And it took a while, and actually what really happened was I mentioned, I think, the American Peace Test and the protest in Nevada, and I flew out there. I had a benefactor at that point in my life, a graduate of Harvard Business School, who's still in my life. He's this rich guy, and he gave me, a couple $1,000 to bring Eric Weinberger, Rob Anderson, and my partner Tess Willett, the mother of my son, and myself. The four of us flew out to Nevada. We brought Coleman stoves and pots and all this stuff, equipment. And we met Keith there. He drove from San Francisco in his truck, and we gleaned food from Las Vegas, and we cooked it up and served food at the Nevada test site. And at the end of the event, we gave all the equipment to Keith and said, take it home with you and start a Food Not Bombs in San Francisco. We didn't take it home with us. We had equipment back in Boston. We didn't need it.
Right.
So we gave him all that equipment, and we had 700 pounds of food, rice and beans, left over when we started with nothing when we got there. But by just gleaning food and collecting donation stuff, we had food left over that he brought back to San Francisco. And it was important to me because I remember that from March, when that protest was, to May, when he started serving in Golden Gate Park, those bags of beans and rice sat in the hallway of his apartment building and was like a problem. we had to like start using it because the landlord was complaining and Keith's wife was complaining. Keith's wife was really upset with the whole idea of me visiting and encouraging to be an activist. It was just this whole bizarre and wild scene. But eventually he did start serving 1 day a week in Golden Gate Park on Mondays because that was the one meal. The churches and the civic groups in Haight-Ashbury had a free lunch and a free dinner for the homeless. And this is 1988 now. There's a lot of homeless people now because Ronald Reagan's been president for 8 years, and now George Bush is president, and there's a lot of homeless people. So they were serving lunch and dinner every day except Monday lunch.
Goodness.
So he said, I'll do Monday lunch. And every Monday he'd go out there and serve lunch to the homeless folks in Golden Gate Park. And that was the second Food Not Bombs.
Okay. And that was in San Francisco, and this was circa 1992-ish?
1980.
Oh,
1988.
88. Okay, I'm sorry.
1988.
All right.
No, 1988. And so the arrest started in August of 1988. And that put us on the map internationally.
Okay, so let's talk about that. You know, what were the legal issues and challenges surrounding Food Not Bombs, and what were the root causes of the arrests of the Food Not Bombs activists? Because in reading and researching for this, that just seemed to have blown up like overnight. You guys were immediately beginning to be attacked by the police and the authorities. So what was that about? Because as things go, in Boston, Cambridge, you guys were, you said the police would even defend you,
Yes.
with the federal authorities. So you were not only a benign, non-threatening group, you were respected in the community, but in San Francisco, trying to do the same thing with a greater need, the authorities suddenly took it upon themselves to start harassing and attacking. So what was that all about?
Okay, so the real answer is always, anytime I've ever been asked this question since 1988, I've always had to say there's two answers. Because one is the real answer, what was really going on, and the other is what the police would say, what everybody would talk about, and create this other reality, which became a reality too. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it wasn't true, it just was this other reality. So in my opinion, the real reason was because of the authorities, that they had decided that not only did they not care that their economic policies were creating more and more economic injustice and more hungry people in the United States, they didn't want anybody to know about it. And of course, our whole mission was to make it visible.
Right.
So that was why they had to stop us. They saw us growing and spreading, not stopping. We now had, because we also had a chapter in Long Beach, and the idea was going to come. They saw it was going to mushroom, and they were trying to stop it from that. Of course, by arresting us, it helped it mushroom.
Right, because it got notoriety then.
Right.
And nobody with a half a brain is going to say that feeding people is wrong. The average community responds to that, because even my 80-year-old mother would say, that's just wrong. Those people need to be fed.
Exactly. And that was the beauty of Food Not Bombs, and that was the strength of it. But I want to get back to a point that you're making that's a little more subtle, and it's a little harder to get at, and it's very, very important to me. The book came out in 1992, okay? We had by 1990, 91, we started organizing more chapters. We started overtly trying to start more Food Not Bombs chapters, okay? Maybe even by 1989. And one of the flyers that Keith produced, I don't know exactly who wrote it, but I'm pretty sure Keith produced it, was about the 7 steps for starting a Food Not Bombs. And a publisher, a radical publisher in Philadelphia, where there was a Food Not Bombs now by 1990 in West Philadelphia, there was a collective that started what's still there, the Lava Zone, an autonomous space, right? And there was an activist publisher called New Society Publishers that was based in Philadelphia. They've since been bought out by a company that's in Canada. So New Society still exists, but it's not the same people. And that was long ago. And this was way back in like I said, in the early 90s. And this man, Martin Kelly, contacted me. He was doing Food Not Bombs in Philadelphia. And he said, CT, you should write a book about using the 7 steps as a model for a whole book. The book you held up, right, with all how to do Food Not Bombs. And I said, great idea. And I said, but, and so I never did it, because he and I would see each other at conferences and rallies around the country, because that's what I was doing at the time to make money, was travel around the country, showing up at conferences, selling my consensus. Well, yeah, I had my consensus book at that point. So I was selling my consensus book and selling buttons and bumper stickers. And he'd always have the table next to me. So we would hang out all weekend talking. And he kept telling me, write a book, write a book. And so finally he said, CT, how about if I paid you $1,000 to write the book? And I said, okay, now you're talking. So he gave me $1,000 to write the book. And what I spent it on was 10 days at Keith's house. I flew to San Francisco. He and I, unplugged the phones, told everybody we were away on vacation, and spent 10 days and wrote that book. And, I did most of the writing, but it was really we both did it together in the sense that we were there right together. And I had more computer skills and I had more command of the English language, but it was our story, And I wanted Keith to be a co-author because he was being denigrated by the authorities in San Francisco and being called a phony and a hypocrite and a rich kid who was just playing and saying all these discrediting things. And he like me although he actually graduated from college, but he didn't have an advanced degree, and he had no credentials to his name. And I was a college dropout, so I had no credentials to my name. So I said, if we write a book, that'll give us some credentials. And so we both put our names on the cover to protect ourselves, really. And we wrote the book, but the 7 steps is very, very important to me, because the original Food Not Bombs, and as I told you the story how it developed in Cambridge, we developed or grew this distribution network. And the politics is very important. I didn't really cover the politics of it. As we had more and more food, and we couldn't eat it ourselves, and we couldn't give it away to other activists, and we couldn't give it away at protests and rallies fast enough, we still had more food than that. Even though we were already being caterers for the movement, we were doing our own events, we were organizing our own protests, and we were feeding everybody we could, and we still had more food. So instead of throwing it away, what are you going to do with it? Well, obviously, the logical thing is to give it to people who need it, give it to poor people. But we were already exhausted. So we said, we can't ourselves distribute it to people in need. There's too many of them and too few of us. So what we did politically was we said we should approach activists in the poor neighborhoods, in the economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, who were doing things like tenant rights work or immigrant rights work or women's health care or daycares. Or you follow the drift, right?
Mm-hmm.
These
Right,
various
right.
other activist groups that had offices and a staff of 2 or 3 people and were operating on a shoestring, but they were actually in the neighborhoods. And we would go to them, knock on their door and say, look, what do you think about the idea that if one day a week we come by your office and we offload as much food as you want for free, dry goods and perishables, fruits, vegetables, bread, and as much grain and beans as we can. And the deal is we'll give you as much as you want. You need to be responsible for bagging it up into individual proportions and distributing it to your constituents. Mm-hmm. And our idea is that, for example, with the Women's Health Center, we said you can say on Thursdays, not only can you come in and get a free breast exam, but a bag of groceries to bring home to your family, to encourage women to get a breast exam. Follow what I'm saying?
Oh yeah, it's a great idea.
So that's what we were doing. And we had a network of 30 or 40 or maybe 50 different agencies like that we were distributing food to every day. Not every day, all of them. We do 1 day a week. Each
Right.
one of them, we do 6 to 10 a day,
Right.
5 days a week. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
And that's how we distributed the food. And we distributed food in all of the major housing projects of the 60s that were, really bad news. We distributed food to all the elderly housing concentrations. We were supplying food to all the meals programs. We were supplying food to everybody in Cambridge. That's really important because, in terms of having the goodwill of the government, this is what it looked like. Mm-hmm. When we were doing it as Food Not Bombs, the original collective in 1982, we were doing it as a radical act. We just did it. We didn't ask anybody's permission. We just did it. And we were persistent at getting the food too. We didn't let the food purveyors say no to us. We showed up daily if we had to. We did. We showed up daily, many places, to prove to them that we were going to be responsible and be able to collect the food. And sometimes we would have to show up daily for weeks asking for food and being rejected until we finally wore them down and got them to give it to us. Literally.
Never give up.
They never give up, exactly. One bakery owner guy said you could only come between 7:30 a.m. and 7:35 a.m. That's the only time you can come each day. If you come then, I'll give you the food, because he had a trash compactor. And at 7:35, he pushed the button and squished it all. And he'd laugh if we showed up at 7:36, which only happened 2 or 3 times in a year. That's how good we were. We were always there at 7:30, but we got anywhere from 1 to 5 bags of bread that was made yesterday of whole grains with no preservatives. Awesome food, made yesterday. And by the end of that day, we had distributed it to people who were going to eat it that night for free. So that's what we were doing. So when we realized that when Food Not Bombs busted up in '83, and we realized, Brian and I realized we couldn't continue it any longer, we wanted to turn it over to the city. That was our first idea. We went to the Department of Human Services, the city of Cambridge, a woman named Isabella Hines. And I sat down in her office, and of course I'm full hair, right? I have long hair, full beard, total hippie, tie-dye t-shirt, bell bottoms, whatever you want to see. And I'll go into her office and I tell her, look, I've got this amazing network of free food. I want to give it over to the city so you can keep feeding these people. And she patted me on the head and said, oh, that's cute. You're really nice. Thank you very much. Don't call me. I'll call you. Within 2 weeks, I got a phone call from Isabella Hines. Oh, Mr. Butler, could you please come back into our office? We'd like to talk to you. I show up. They have the red carpet out. They're offering me coffee. They're treating me with kid gloves. They're all excited because she knew nothing about what we were doing. She's the director of human social services in the city of Cambridge. She knew nothing about what we were doing. And she asked her lieutenants that were all in the field, what's this group, Food Not Bombs, and what are they doing? And they claim to be in every housing project. Are they? And every one of them came back and said, holy shit, yeah, they are. Man, they're doing great work. All these people are raving about how fantastic they are. Every week they come by with all the food they can eat. And that's why she called us back, because it was really true. Mm-hmm. And we started a working relationship that lasted for several years, starting Food for Free and having Food for Free take off, because her advice was start your own nonprofit and continue doing what you're doing as a nonprofit. And she supported us, and she was one of our major supporters in the early years, getting us funding, and we had the city of Cambridge had our back.
Right.
But look at that politically, right? We had this amazing network of goodwill, and for her to diss us would have been very bad for her.
Right. Because you had the people on your side and the numbers on your side.
And we actually ran somebody for city council, and city council in Cambridge back then used to elect by proportional representation. It was the only other city, I think there's one other city, Bellingham, Washington, maybe was the other city or someplace like that. But anyway, and we ran one of our collective members for city council in '82, or maybe even '83, '82 probably. And we got votes. We didn't win by any stretch, but we got votes in every ward in the city. At least one vote. Totally across the board. Totally freaked the politicians out because nobody did that. Even the people who won didn't get votes in every ward. So we had this amazing network. So that's the first thing, is that we had generated a tremendous amount of political power by distributing free food to thousands of people throughout the city of Cambridge. And now they were beholden to us. And so they respected us. That's important. Secondly, we had also, and through the era of the '84 to '87, '88 in Cambridge, when I was going to every protest in New England and bringing free food, and it really got to be the case that if you had a protest, you organized a protest in New England in 1986, and Food Not Bombs didn't show up and serve food, it wasn't a very important protest. I mean, I don't mean to be bragging. I just mean that we were everywhere, and we were in Harvard Square every day doing a literature table. We were always there. Even the catalog books for Harvard University, they showed a picture of Harvard Square, the business part of it. You'd see the Food Not Bombs table because they couldn't take a picture with us not there. We were always there. That's where we did the story yesterday about the paper mache Earth and the paper mache missile. Right. That was Square. That was that whole thing. So And technically it was Brattle Square later because they redid it when they redid the Red Line. So then what we were doing, the second part, the first political thing was distributing the food to the people in need because to not waste it as an environmental statement that there's enough food to feed everybody who needs it. And we did that and got a lot of political power that way. Then we were feeding all the activists, and we were making there was a bus driver strike, and the bus drivers were picketing the company all day long. And we would show up at noon with lunch so they could stay all day long and not have to leave to go get food. And we'd bring bags of groceries and say, take it home to your family. And you can appreciate how powerful that is when you're on strike as a bus driver, not making much money to begin with, and now you're struggling to survive, and these hippies come along and give you all the food you can eat. Tremendous political power, political capital. So now we have all the social service agencies in the city in our hands, if you will, and all the activist groups loving us because we were helping them out so much, and all the protesting going on. So we were a formidable political force. That's why we could do protests out in public and they wouldn't touch us. Mm-hmm. The police didn't touch us. They let us do it because we had support. Well, Keith turned up in San Francisco. His wife wasn't particularly supportive. He didn't really have a group. He had two young men helping him through the arrests. I mean, a bunch of people showed up and helped on the spot, but in terms of the meetings and the getting the supplies and doing the cooking, it was basically just Keith and a couple of friends. And they didn't have this whole network. They weren't collecting free food. They weren't doing the free, the recycling. They were buying the food. Well, actually, they were using the rice and beans they had brought back from the pet site. That's where the food came from, by and large. And then maybe they were doing some recycling of food. I don't know exactly. I didn't get to there until September. I jumped in my car and drove out there to be there for the arrest. And I missed the actual arrest. I didn't get arrested that particular time. But I did get involved in helping try to create we got a permit. I helped the negotiations to get a permit, basically. So the arrest stopped. But the point I'm making is that when they just showed up on the street and did so in the 7 steps of starting a Food Not Bombs, the first 4 are how to organize a group and get a group started. The 5th one is distribute the food, bulk. The 6th one is cater to the movement. And the 7th one is do your own protests out in front of City Hall or in the park or in public spaces feeding people as both reclaiming public space, our right to feed people who are hungry in public space without the government interference, and we shouldn't be wasting the food in the first place. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so that was number 7. And you see what happens now is that the Food Not Bombs chapters pretty much everywhere, because they follow the San Francisco model and not the Cambridge model. What they do is they organize a group, they do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and then they jump to 7. And they skip over 5 and 6, which is the political capital that prevents them from getting arrested. So while it isn't a problem that they do get arrested, because that creates a lot of media attention, that gets the conversation going about both public space and about the argument that all across the country, every time, and now Food Not Bombs groups have been arrested in dozens of cities. It's increasing as we go along, especially starting about 2005. I think that was the first year there was more than one city where the Food Not Bombs group was being attacked by the police and being arrested. And now it's regular, and there's been a whole thing that happened in Orlando, Florida, that went all the way up to the appellate court about whether Food Not Bombs has the right to use public space to feed people without interference by the government, both as free speech, use of free assembly in public space, and then the whole issue of, because every police force and every newspaper repeats the lie that the reason why we're getting arrested is because of public health issues, that we're posing a threat to the public health because we're serving food without a license. Well, the reason why that's true from their perspective is because there is no such thing in the capitalist system and the current government jurisprudence of giving food away. When you give something to a non-related adult, that is a sale, even if no money changes hands. And I know this is true because I was around, I remember back in college in Delaware, there was a kid who was arrested selling pot, basically, and he tried to use the defense that he was giving it away, and there was no sale, and therefore he wasn't a dealer, and he wasn't selling it. And the government said, no, you can't use that defense because just giving it away is still a sale. So I remember that very clearly. The government doesn't recognize giving anything away. So they're claiming we're selling it, and therefore we're selling without a license. My argument's always been that when you're selling food for a profit, you have incentive to cut corners. That jeopardizes the public health. That's why you need the health department to prevent people from doing that. That is true. But if you're a cooperative group, you're trying to help people, you have no incentive to doing anything short of health.
Right.
You want to help these people. You don't want to hurt them. So, and it, never mind the fact that we were strict vegetarian. And of course, with vegetarian food, it's very difficult to make somebody sick with food. It can be done, but it's much harder. And the basic reason is that meat and dairy, and most people don't realize that for anybody to sell meat and dairy, you have to have a license. It's actually called a milk license. Just like there is an alcohol license to sell alcohol, there's a milk license for everybody who sells milk, because it's dangerous to sell milk and meat. Milk license covers meat products too, because milk products and meat products can go bad and make you sick and even kill you and still taste good. Vegetables, when they go bad and make you sick, very hard to kill you unless you have an allergy to it. There are a few things that can kill you in vegetables, pure vegetables. But the thing is, when vegetables go bad, they taste bad.
Right.
You wouldn't eat it if it was bad enough to make you sick.
Right.
Now, that's basically true. Now, there's a gray area and there's a little bit of wiggle room there, but that's generally the point. So I'm a professional chef, so I knew that there was a way to serve vegetarian food on the street safely. And of course, we've been doing this now for 30 years, and we've never hurt anybody. It's not a problem when you stick, and that's one of the reasons why we're vegetarian, along with the fact that it's also nonviolent. But also is that it protects the people who are eating the food. They're not going to get sick, and if they do get sick, it's only going to be minor. It's not going to kill them. And we're now more sensitive to allergies and pay attention to that as well. So my overall point is that when Food Not Bombs groups go directly to number 7 and skip over all the important information that's in the book about doing 5 and 6, they make themselves vulnerable to repression by the government that wouldn't happen if they did 5 and 6.
Because they don't have the community support, because the distribution element was neglected, so they didn't build that political goodwill.
Right. Now, that's not a problem, because they do still get community support by and large, because just like your 80-year-old mother, it's obvious that giving people free food is not a problem. That should be an okay thing to do. And, but how they convince us is we were going to let them, we were going to give them a permit and tell them to do it healthy, and they refused the permit. Well, that's not the reason why we refused the permit. We did refuse the permit because the permit said we could only do it one day a year.
Right. And I want, for the people who are watching who aren't familiar with it, and again, I've been telling everybody, you need to read this book, not only because it's specific to Food Not Bombs, but it's also a guide to activism in general, which struck me. I was not prepared for that, but there's a consistent overview of activism in general. But the book is very well organized, and within the book, it clearly states how to make hand washing stations, how to make dishwashing stations, and I've done field cooking also, and I know it's dead on. It meets or exceeds every sanitation requirement, probably better than a lot of restaurants.
Exactly.
They're just using the sanitation law as a gimmick to break down the effort. So to
break down the public support. See, the motif itself generates public support. Even conservative people don't think it's bad to feed poor people in the park.
Right.
But when they're told that we're violating sanitation rules and we're refusing to cooperate, then they turn against us.
Right.
You see, if they knew who we were and they had met us before the police started saying that, they wouldn't believe it. But since they'd never met us, because all the Food Not Bombs groups do is this, what I see is kind of isolated kind of protest mentality of interacting with the community from a protest place. I'm not against that. I think that's great. It's part of my legacy. But it also is valuable to organize the community from where they are. And using food to do that is a great tool.
I agree, and it's such a generous and loving thing to do, and the fact that it's just reclaimed, it's repurposed, reclaimed, and redistributed to people in need. And that's just, honestly, it sounds corny, but that's heartwarming, and it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And everything good that comes downstream of that is extremely valuable. Um,
Yep.
I want to kind of start towards wrapping this up,
Yes.
and again, I get to ask my lessons learned question. Well, actually, no. We'll extend this out a little bit. I want to hear how you've been active in Food Not Bombs, going around, to various occupies, your relationships with there as it relates to food activism, and kind of what you've been doing, because you still are active, and we talked about this offline, in the action of feeding people and the action of distributing food. And how does that interface with Occupy?
That's a great question and a really painful one for me, because I'm only now, at this point in my life, being concerned about the fact that most Food Not Bombs chapters, not all, I've met notable exceptions like the one on Long Island and other places, but most of them tend to serve meals one day a week. It's not a full-time thing, and they don't do the 5 and 6. They don't do the distribution. They don't do the catering, or they do a little bit of catering to other protests, but they do their own thing, and they do their own protests, and they do their own feed once a week or twice a week or whatever. And so they only have enough food to feed 100 people or so at any given on hand, right? And they don't have a network for feeding more than 100 people generally in most towns. So when Occupy happened, I realized, and I would go around and talk about how if Food Not Bombs had been the Cambridge model all these years, and all these chapters all over the country were doing the Cambridge model, then what it would look like was that when an Occupy sprung up in an encampment in the town square in the center of Philadelphia or Boston or any, hundreds of them did ultimately spring up all across the country, then the local Food Not Bombs could have immediately diverted this huge flow of food that they were distributing every day, literally tons of food every day, because it could happen everywhere. And they could have said to all their network, all those social service agencies that were delivering food to each day, all the catering jobs they had said they were going to do out into the future at all these rallies, they could have said to them, now that Occupy has started, you have to come and get your food downtown because all the food is going to Occupy, and that's where you get it. And that would make them all have to come down to the square to visit Occupy to get their food.
And by virtue,
I don't think any fill in or blanks.
then by virtue that draws people in, they become engaged in the movement, and nature takes its course.
It would have been huge. It would have been huge. That is what was supposed to have happened. But Occupy happened too soon. Because I am going to write a book about what we're talking about tonight. And that's the point of this book, is to reinvigorate, to re-inspire the Food Not Bombs movement to actually do 5 and 6 as well as 7. There's nothing wrong with what they're doing, but they could do more. And so what happened in Occupy as I traveled around was I would often get together with the food committee. More than half the time, it was not the local Food Not Bombs group. Sometimes the Food Not Bombs group had shown up early in the protest of Occupy, and then it was too much. We overwhelmed them, and they had to go back to what they were doing. Sometimes it was the Food Not Bombs group, but mostly it was just new people doing food work. Mm-hmm. And they had no idea how to collect free food. They were mostly trying to get donations of food and of money to buy food. And so therefore what it meant was they got a lot of crappy food. Not a lot of fresh fruit, not a lot of fresh vegetables, which is what you get when you get waste food from the grocery stores. That's what you get. But when you're getting donations and stuff, you're getting, pizza and prepared foods and often meat and stuff that could actually make people sick because it comes down to Occupy and sits there all day and people keep eating it. So it was really not very, and it was so painful for me because I would do, and I think I did Food Not Bombs workshops in a number of cities where I tried to inspire and offer visions of how they could set up a Food Not Bombs type operation, a Cambridge version. But the big challenge was that Occupy was so ethereal. No, that's not our word. I can't remember the word. It was transient. It was immediate. They had a very hard time organizing long range and setting up relationships with people who go on day after day after day or week after week after week. And so I didn't make much penetration. I don't think it didn't really happen.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, by December, most of the encampments were evicted. Although there are still a few around the country that's still ongoing, but by and large, the food aspect of the encampments was not well handled,
Right.
in my opinion.
I want to come back to the 5 and 6 about the food collection and distribution and building that network, because I see with Occupy being ephemeral and ever shifting and location shifting and all that, it is hard to have a long range plan for distribution and all that. But the wheel turns, and we may have that opportunity. We just have to negotiate the changing conditions. So I love the idea about using the food as a central locus point for everybody to gather around, because then it benefits Occupy, it benefits the protesters, it benefits the homeless. It is a truly collective endeavor. We're just going to remain optimistic that can happen.
Okay.
And it's just got to start small. Maybe it starts with a small occupation. One of the production team is from Cincinnati, and she said for quite a while that Food Not Bombs in Cincinnati was providing the food for the Cincinnati occupation, and it was outstanding. So
Excellent.
It can happen. It just doesn't as frequently as we want, or that we would hope.
And Cincinnati has a really good Food Not Bombs chapter.
Right. So it was established, right, for longevity. Sometimes the Occupy coming out of nowhere and getting so big and then being so nebulous kind of worked against accomplishing some of the longer range goals.
But there is still hope. We're still working on it.
And your book will help, because we got to inspire people. I think that's it. If we can just inspire people and get them to be thoughtful and considerate and slow down and do that. So that kind of speaks to. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just said I'd really like to inspire them to read the actual books, not just know they exist, but actually read them.
Right.
Both the Food Not Bombs book, which is out of print, but you can get it on Amazon used, so that is still available. My other books on consensus, I had the same experience with Occupy there, where they would say they use consensus and they use my book, and then I'd ask, have you actually read it? And they would say no. And I'd beat Food Not Bombs groups where they say, yeah, we know about your book, it's so inspiring. I said, well, did you actually read it? And they would actually say no. So I really like to inspire people to actually read the book, and it's really quite an honor as an author, even for you, to have read my book. I really appreciate that.
I got a lot out of it. It was just so I can see where people have glanced at the book, and they pulled out some of the highlights, and then they operate and they reference it, right? But the detail of it is fascinating, and I've been encouraging everybody to read it.
Great.
What can we do? Let's wrap this up. What can we do as viewers and people out in the ether to help support Food Not Bombs actions or food activism in general? And I think I'm getting an inkling, because I am actually involved in a community gardens here in our county. We're in a real rural area.
Okay.
But the gardens do something similar to what you were saying about the food distribution, because we have the soup kitchen that cooks once a week, but the gardens produce every day, especially this time of year. So they bag food up and take it to the women's shelter and the elderly residents and all that. So, but just maybe some other ideas of how we as people out in the universe can contribute to that effort and maybe help make a difference.
Well, the great thing about food activism, and especially the kind of motif that Food Not Bombs is that it doesn't require much money. You don't have to do fundraising. You don't have to have money. You just go out and start identifying sources of waste food and start collecting it, and then start looking for places to get people to eat it. It's pretty much that simple. Doing it's got finesse, and each place has its own problems and finding. But truthfully, in the early days, especially for me, when I first started approaching sources, it was easier to get the food than it was to give it away. So actually finding appropriate places to distribute it, making sure it gets distributed fairly, that somebody isn't hoarding it or selling it after they get it from you. Those are the sticky wickets, the things that you have to work on. But setting up a network where you collect food that's being wasted or surplus food and taking it and giving it to people who need it and being that conduit, being that connection, that's what's missing and that's what's needed. And you can also, we had a policy that we could keep, I think it was 20% of anything we collected. So if we got a case of raspberries, we took permission to take 2 quarts for ourselves. Mm-hmm. Because we got to eat it too. We're human. We need to eat too.
Right.
So we got to keep some of the food for ourselves and then give the rest of it away. And just do that. So the Food Not Bombs really is a self. It doesn't require a lot of money. It never was a big thing around money, and you don't have to fundraise to do it. Just go out there and start doing it. And if there is a local Food Not Bombs in your area, join it and be a part of it, and encourage them to grow and read the book. And do the whole 7 steps, not just the last one. And so that's around food. Well, go ahead. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that was a good way to wrap it up. We're really interested, a bunch of us, in food justice and how that interfaces with social justice. We want to do a series. We're going to take a couple of questions now, if I can read them off really quick. When we hear about food pantries or food banks being low on food, is that true? And how can that be so if there is a surplus?
Because by and large, and I think it's still true to this day, it was definitely true in my day, the pantries and the food banks, well, because they're physical locations that people have to come to get the food, they don't have a lot of resources for holding the food. So they need non-perishables. And what they mostly distribute is non-perishables.
Right.
And non-perishables are tricky because the retailers don't throw away non-perishables because they're about to go bad. They're not fresh. They throw them away because they can't sell them. There's a reason why they can't sell them. Sometimes it's because the label's fallen off or the can's gotten only minorly dented or something like that, and then it's still perfectly good. But I know that the corporations that produce food, the big corporations, have used Second Harvest and the food banks and food pantries as a way to dump food they can't sell because it's not very good food often. And they can give it to the food banks and get a tax write-off. Huge tax write-off sometimes. And then I have seen, I'll never forget, back in my day when I was doing this, there was a peanut butter shortage. I don't know if people remember that, but in the mid-'80s, suddenly there was no peanut butter. This really happened. And it was a drought or something, and there was no peanut butter. So these corporations got the idea they'd make sunflower butter, raw sunflower butter. It's basically inedible. It's edible, but it's really required. It's really hard to take. It's really dense. It's thick. It's got a flavor that's really hard to take. Toasted sesame seeds sunflower seeds are better, but they would do raw. And I went to the food bank once, and there was literally cases and cases, floor to ceiling, a huge amount. I don't know how much, tons of sunflower butter at the food bank that sat there for years, and they couldn't give it away. And they eventually threw it away.
Yeah. But it was dumped off by some distributor.
Exactly, because they couldn't sell it. So the people who are doing that work, it's gotten better in the last 10 years, I think. So I don't want to be too critical, but I know that prior to the 2000, when I was doing this daily, and involved in the work directly, that they were really part of the system. They weren't trying to break the system. They weren't trying to break out of the system.
Right.
And they didn't have really good ability to deal with perishable foods, of which there's so much more waste.
Right.
So they didn't. So that's what they're talking about. And I have a lot of stories about that I'm not getting into.
Right. Well, it makes sense because I think the food banks are they provide a good service and they're certainly better than nothing. But all the ones that I've been involved with, they just can't handle perishables because they don't have refrigeration, they don't have storage, they don't have the room. It sort of makes sense. Somebody's asking, is Do you know if the other co-founders are still involved in activism?
Yes.
Yeah, for the most part, it sounds
I
like.
know. I know. I know. I
Yeah,
do know. Yes. I
yeah.
kept track with just about everybody.
Okay, that's good. That's
Uh,
good. So we got a whole bunch of 30-year plus activists out there. That makes me happy.
yes. Well, but no. But I said, let's see. There were if you there were 6 people who lived in the house, or maybe 7, and then there was so let's see. So Keith is still doing Food Not Bombs ongoing. He's at the center of Food Not Bombs as his primary activity. I'm still active, but as you can see on the Etherpad, I've diversified. I work in a whole bunch of different movements. I have my whole life. So Food Not Bombs is just one of the many activist things I do.
Right.
Brian, who I referred to, he became a dancer. First went to New York to be a dancer there, and then ended up in Boston. And he's still dancing and being a paralegal. He eventually did get a career in law. He didn't become a lawyer, but but he didn't do activism. He went to the arts. Sue, she dropped out of activism shortly after the collective broke up, but she is also still very involved in the arts. She still dances regularly. She's very involved with She works with children and does all kinds of home education and creative work with children. So, but that's not really activism work. She's not really politically active. Mira Brown, she's semi-famous in the sense that she continued her activism. She was very involved after she left Food Not Bombs. She went out to the West Coast. She met a man by the name of Ben Linder. Does that mean anything to you?
Yeah, yeah.
Ben Linder?
Yeah.
Do you remember?
Um,
He was murdered by the Contra in Nicaragua
mhm.
in the late 80s or mid-80s. I can't remember what year.
Right.
It must have been the mid-80s, actually. And Mira was his partner. She was there. And she didn't get killed only because she had an infected finger and she went to the clinic, the health clinic, which, because it was Nicaragua, was a 3-hour walk from the village they were building a hydroelectric plant for. And so she walked to the health clinic and was gone the whole day. And that day, the Contra attacked their hydroelectric project and killed everybody who was there, including Ben Linder, who was a U.S. citizen. It was a big problem for the U.S. government because mercenaries that the U.S. government had paid had killed a U.S. citizen on foreign soil. And it was a big controversy. And Mira was there. She was part of that story. And she's still, well, what she's doing now is she's in the Boston area teaching. And I assume she's still an activist. I don't know that she is.
If she's teaching, she's an activist.
Right. Well, and then Amy Rothstein, who is a co-author of my consensus book, she is got her own software business and is not what you would usually call an activist, but she's definitely still in the spirit of acting. She's still, I mean, all of us are still care, but in terms of day-to-day activity, as far as I know, she's not doing activism directly. Although she was very inspired by the Occupy movement, I think she got back involved with that.
Yep.
And then the other 2 people, that's the 6 people who were the original core. There was this young man who was a teenager, an underage adult, named Jesse Constable. I totally lost contact with him. I have no idea what happened to him after he left the collective, and I don't know that he stayed active. And then there was a woman who never lived in the house but was part of our collective. She lived in another group house, actually the group house that Keith moved to after he left our collective. And her name is Jo Swanson, and she dropped out for a while, but I've heard most recently that she's back doing some local activism. I think she's in Colorado. So that's a summary of all the various activists.
So a lot of people still remaining engaged in various ways, which is really, inspiring. It's, we need to follow those kinds of examples. This next question is, I'll try to get it correct. It's a little involved. When Uppitty's asking about the massive exodus from family farms, over prior to Monsanto and corporate hegemony, and why do we think there was a massive exodus from the family farms? And could you speak to the lifestyle of food production, why it was abandoned, and is it worth revisiting? So because we have this conversation. That's a big
That's a
question.
huge question.
But let me.
Yeah.
So we had fairly sustainable family farms. History happened. We got away from that, and so now a lot of people are like, "Oh, we should grow our own food." Is that really a viable solution, a viable activity, and is it worth revisiting?
Well, I don't know exactly what that means, worth revisiting. Certainly, the idea of eating locally and only eating food that grows in your neighborhood, in your local area, in your town, I think that's a good idea. I think we should stop trucking food all around the world and shipping it all around the world. That's a really bad idea. So we should stop trucking food. But the flight from the family farm and the flight from rural to city, the flight from the south to the north, all that stuff that happened related to the industrial age was all about the apparent ease at working in a factory job and having all these things in your life, all these commodities, especially after the Second World War, when that really took off. So everybody thought, wow, what a great life. You can just go work in a factory or work in a shop somewhere, and you can have your weekends free, and you can have cars and TVs and now computers, and you can have all these toys to play with. And what a much nicer life than having to work on the farm day in and day out, toiling, so it just looked like so much better. Now we're looking at the other side of the coin. The other shoe dropped, and there was a heavy price to pay in terms of loss of community, loss of connection to other people, massive alienation, massive psychological problems, drug use, alcohol abuse, violence in the family, violence in general, breakdown of society, corporations dominating, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So, yes, I think there is, and that's a great segue. And the reason why you see on my Etherpad that I've put a lot about, comparatively, about the intentional communities movement, and even put a link to the intentional communities website. One of the very, very first web pages on the web was ic.org. They were way there early on. And intentional communities is a movement. It's the original, at least the modern intentional communities movement, came out of the 60s, back to the land hippie commune. There were a lot that started. When the first directory came out in the late 70s, there were 500 in North America. These were groups of people as small as 20 and as large as 2,000 that went and bought farms and started intentional communities and grew their own food and became self-sufficient and basically ignored the rest of society. And they have created a model for both sustainability in terms of the environment and in terms of economics. They've created a sustainable model of community and a sustainable model of governance. And everybody should be looking towards them for the lessons they've learned over the last 50 years of how we're going to get through the current crisis, because they already figured out the answers. We don't have to reinvent anything. We already know what to do in the intentional communities, how to survive when peak oil happens and there's no more oil, and when the corporations become so corrupt they collapse because of their own stupidity. So yes, we do have to return. I don't know that when the country was founded, something like 90% of the population were farmers. So this country was a farm country when it started. And now it's something like exactly the opposite, and even less. I think it's like 5% or something are involved in farming. So that's that shift that's happened, and that's out of balance. The industrial age wasn't bad per se, but it went too far. Way too far, and the advent of the corporations was a disaster.
Right, to the other extreme. And I know that the source of that question, because this person was a friend of mine, and we often talk about I grew up on a farm, so I know it's easy to say we should all grow our own food. I know it's extraordinarily difficult and probably not for everybody, and nor should they do it. But the intentional communities was a great answer to that. I've got a quick question. People are interested in, did Food Not Bombs have good relationships with the people you were gleaning food from? Did you get hassled by supermarkets, or did you developed relationships so you weren't having to do it on the sly? Because I think you spoke to that. You would go every day until they just gave up and said, okay, here we'll work with you, or how did that transpire? Pretty good
Well,
relationships.
this really should be no surprise to people, but I imagine it might be that the workers in the stores and in the factories and the places we went, the actual workers, they loved it. They thought it was great and they helped us. The management, not so easy. We often had to really work with the manager. Like I said, the manager of this one bakery, he was like sadistic. He'd like laugh at us if we showed up after 7:35. That's just weird, right? But he was a manager. The workers never did that. They wouldn't care. They didn't care when we showed up. So, and sometimes we lost sites. We would work with the workers. We wouldn't even talk to the management. We would just start doing it out back. Literally how it started. I mean, in the first couple of weeks, when I first started doing the distribution, when I first started getting the food, I would actually climb into the dumpsters. That's what I first learned, was to go into the dumpsters. Mm-hmm. Back then, they weren't locked and they weren't poisoned and they weren't compacted. That was all new, or becoming new. So I literally climbed into the dumpsters, but that's pretty dirty work and not so healthy and a little bit dangerous. So quite quickly, because I'd often get caught in the dumpsters when the workers were coming out to bring out the trash, right? And they'd say, what are you doing in there? And I would explain to them what I'm doing. Oh, man, that's pretty cool. I said, look, when you have food that looks like it might be edible, instead of throwing it in the dumpster, throw it into a box next to the dumpster. And that way I don't have to climb into the dumpster to get it. They go, oh, sure, man, no problem. I'll do that. And then another week later, I said, look, it's rotten out here in the sun. Could you hold it in the walk-in? And I'll knock on the door and just hand me the box, and I'll make away with it. I said, okay, no problem. We'll do that. Because at this point, we're having, talking every day, shooting the shit, getting to be friends and stuff. So within a month, I was getting it held inside the store, and we'd knock on the back door and get the boxes. And then occasionally the manager would find out, and they would say, no, you can't do that. And then I'd have to do some negotiating, and maybe half the time we'd lose the contact, half the time I'd be able to talk the managers into it. And then sometimes we'd come back a month or two later and start with the workers again, and then this time tell the workers, you got to keep it on the down low. You can't let the management know you're doing it, or else you'll get fired and we'll get in trouble, but we're still going to do it anyway.
Right.
But to be fair, there were also companies that were totally into what we were doing. There was a tofu factory in western Massachusetts that was producing tofu. Tofu wasn't a big thing yet in the United States, and they had a lot of surplus. And they would put it on their truck and leave it at one of the grocery stores for us to pick up in Cambridge. So we literally had tons of tofu all the time.
Excellent. Well, I had the idea just from having the conversations with you that people were mostly receptive and trying to help you out, even if it was a little bit subversive, which, that's always the fun part too, right?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to call it for tonight, and it's been another fabulous evening, and I should tell the viewers and chatters, I said, CT, okay, we're gonna do this in an hour tonight. So I missed it by a mile, but it was well worth it. I loved every minute of it, and I could go on more. Thank you for sharing all those stories and observations and ideas with us. We really appreciate your time and effort again. And tomorrow night, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was going to talk about last night. There's one comment from last night that I didn't get to finish. I just really briefly.
Okay.
Okay, well, you asked the question, what movements and organizations I've ever been a part of, and I only gave a handful. So I'd never really been asked that question before. I never really thought about it before. So I sat down today and tried to write down all the various movements that I've been a part of in some way or other. And so I put that on the Etherpad. And I don't know if, I'm assuming the viewers have access to that.
Yep, we just put it up again for people to pull. And everybody's very appreciative of that. I have to say they're really excited. So thank you for doing that.
That's how I answered that question, was rather than list it and do it from memory, I just wrote it down.
Yeah, that was a big help. So tomorrow night, we're going to go in depth on the values-based consensus decision making. So I'm really excited about that. We'll be back with you at 8 o'clock tomorrow night for the third in our series. I want to wish you and Ren a good evening. Thank you, Ren, for being. Ren's a great facilitator. She's helping out facilitating tonight. She's putting up links and she's doing the stuff, So thank you.
Awesome.
Thanks for sharing the pup with us. That was fun. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow night. Thank you very much.
Very good. You're very welcome.